Thank you. I've gotten quite a bit of coaching about what I could start with. And since I never write speeches, I always speak off the cuff. I'm going to try to keep this within 15 or 20 minutes. It might run slightly over, and then I hope we get into Q&A from wherever people are. The introduction cited the business successes that I've had, and I think that provides a false image of who I am. I am not the CTO of General Motors, nor am I the CEO of EDS. I'm simply Morton Meyerson. I was born and raised in Fort Worth, Texas. My grandparents were immigrants. They were very poor. They came to this country not speaking the language, having no money, and my grandfather was a tailor. He used to walk to work because he couldn't afford to take a bus. He lived on the Lower East Side of New York originally, but wound up in Fort Worth, Texas as an indentured servant. My parents were both born in Texas. I was raised in Fort Worth, which is near Dallas. I live in Dallas now. Many people think of Fort Worth as a different Dallas. It's not. It's a completely different universe. Fort Worth looks west and thinks of cowboys and cattle, and Dallas looks east and thinks of fashion and banking and things of that nature. It's radically different kind of communities. I'm really a product of the Fort Worth community, not Dallas. I went to public schools and had, at a time when the public schools were better than private schools. There were no private schools except for parochial schools. I never met a Catholic until I went to college because they went to separate schools. I lived in a segregated society. I asked during World War II, I was at the train station to see my uncle off on a train to go to World War II. I saw two water fountains. One was white and one was colored. I asked my father, "What's that about?" And he said, "That's for people of color. They have to drink from that fountain." And he said, "But we don't think that way. So I don't ever want to see you disrespect other people because of their color, etc." So I mean, it's just an early lesson that I learned. So I lived in this weird society. I was accepted at Dartmouth, Georgia Tech, and I decided at the last minute not to go, and I applied to the University of Texas at Austin in August, the first week of August. Fortunately, I had good enough grades that they automatically accepted me, and I went to the University of Texas, where I was a liberal arts graduate. I knew nothing about technology. I was a competitive bridge player when I was in the Army, and my partner was a computer guy. He was the software guy, and he said, "I can get you transferred out of this dull job that you're in." I was a young officer in the Army. "You're in this boring job. I can get you to school so you could teach you programming." Of course, I said, "What's programming?" And he said, "Computers." And I said, "What's a computer?" And so the rest is history. So I got sent to the school, and I can remember I remember where I sat. I remember the problem. It was to locate data on a rotating drum. There was an algorithm on the wall. I'd never seen an algorithm like that, but I was able to solve the problem in 15 minutes. And at that moment, I said to myself, "You're going to be a software engineer." And I became one, even though I had a philosophy background and music. I got out of the Army, went to Bell Helicopter, was a data processing engineer, worked in manufacturing where I was the scheduling manager of all the parts and sub-parts, wound up as a young trainee in EDS. Now I'm going to stop there. So that basically is more, to me, is more informative than the fact that I became the CEO of EDS. I did, but it was a backdoor deal. What I want to talk about is two enormous failures that I had. When I was 31 years old, by that time I was running the biggest, most profitable division of EDS based on a concept that I had created, which now is known as outsourcing. The outsourcing didn't exist, the service approach didn't exist, and Ross Perot, who was the CEO of our company and founder, asked me to price a contract. I'd never priced a contract. I was down in the pits writing code, and I didn't know what to do, so I looked at all the ways that contracts were developed in EDS, and I hated them. So I invented something new, which was a comprehensive, take everything, the hardware, the software, the telecommunications, get a amount of something, get a number of increments of work that the customer would understand, divide it into the price, and it became a transactional price, and they outsourced everything to us. I had no idea what I was doing. And I still don't know why I did that, but I did. Anyway, I was like a superstar, and I had been an athlete. I always was a first-string football player. I won all kinds of things. I was president of my senior class, president of the student body. I ran for and lost the student body president of the University of Texas, but I represented the School of Arts and Sciences as the assemblyman, etc. So I had this amazingly wonderful, successful career, and I was 31 years old, and Perot decided to invest in a failing firm in Wall Street that was going bankrupt called DuPont, and he had tried to get some Wall Street person to come in and be the CEO, and nobody would take the job because it was too bad. It was a disaster. And so he turned to me one day and said, so why don't you move to New York and become the CEO? And I said, Ross, I've never taken a business course. I don't know accounting. I have no idea about finance. I don't understand nothing about markets. This is a bad idea. And he said, that really wasn't the question. The question was, do you want to go become CEO? And I said, yes. So I moved to New York with 2 children, 2 and 4 years old, got a rental apartment, and went to work. The company was a total disaster. It lost control of its, quote, back office, the administrative part of the company. And so I asked an accounting firm to come in and do an audit, and we discovered we were missing $86 million, when $86 million was a lot of money. Now it's like pocket change, for next jump, et cetera. But it was a lot of money, and it was lost. And the mafia had taken some of it, et cetera. Into the first year, and it lost $18 or $20 million operating the year I took over. And it was, I can't describe how bad it was. At the end of the first year, we had control of the back office. Our systems ran. We had a perfect audit. Never in the history of Wall Street has a perfect audit been done. And we made money. And at that point, I declared myself pretty good, pretty good. And we ran the firm at 71, 72. 73 was very difficult. The over-the-counter market, now known as NASDAQ, stopped one day in June. There were no bids. It was a crisis that made 2008 look like chump change. In November, the OPEC put an oil embargo on. I got on an airplane that afternoon, flew to Dallas, said to Perot, this is going to be a disaster for the markets. The volumes will go down. We'll stop making money. And he said, so how much money do we need? And I said, put in $25 million. I think we can make $300 million in 5 years. Put in no money, I have to liquidate the firm. And he said, liquidate the firm. That was serious heartburn. I went back to the board, presented to the board, we had no money, came up with a liquidation plan, retained 4 employees and liquidated the firm. I told Ross we had to do it without bankruptcy because if you have bankruptcy, you lose control of accounts and widows and orphans and other people would be hurt, so we had to do it without bankruptcy. I had 114 office leases, and I was negotiating with people like Trump and all kinds of robber barons, real estate people, and I didn't have bankruptcy to hide behind. It was the worst year of my life. Now, the lesson here is you may really think you're great, and it could be that you're on a boat that is floating, and when the tide comes in, and sometimes the tide goes out. I spent a few months, I didn't go to therapy. I should have gone to therapy. I was an absolute basket case. I had never failed at anything except for the lost election for the president of the student body of University of Texas, and I must tell you that was chump change compared to this loss of $50 million. I eventually decided to go back to EDS. I didn't want to. I was mad. I was hostile. I didn't like some things that Ross did, but I decided I would go back and make back $50 million for Perot and for the company, and that would be my payback, and then I'd leave. And of course, I didn't leave. I went back and eventually became president of the company, and the company was bought by GM. All right, I think that the lesson here is more than outside factors may create your success. There's something about internal factors, and I am certain that my arrogance and know-it-allness and certainty fed into the defeat. And it wasn't just the Arab embargo. We were ripe to run into a wall. And it took me years and years and years to get over that. I used to dream about it every night, and the dream was, what could I have done differently? Now, in hiring people, I generally look for people who have failed. I like that a lot better than people who are successful. And I always inquire if I ever personally interview them. And what I'm looking for is, did they absorb the failure and explain to me why it wasn't their fault or circumstances beyond their control? Or did they take it as a lesson in life, take it apart, deconstruct it, figure out what they did wrong, change themselves so that next time it wouldn't happen? If they're the latter person, I'm interested in hiring them. If they're the former person, I'm not. Most of the people I meet fit in the category of the former person. They actually don't ever get what happened. You have to admit to yourself that you screwed it up. All right, the second thing I'm going to talk about is, I'm going to try to make this shorter, is something that I've only discovered in the last few years. I'm 76 years old come June. I've been around a long time. I've done a lot of things. I've been working since I've been 14. One of the worst decisions I made, which I thought was a great decision until a few years ago. In 1986, I was CTO of General Motors. I had told General Motors that I wasn't really a fit. I told the CEO that I wanted to leave, and he asked me to stay on because he didn't like Perot, and it was running all of the IT, all the information technology for General Motors worldwide, and he was afraid that if I left, something bad would happen. So I agreed to stay and train a replacement, etc. But I came up with an idea to save both General Motors, because I thought they were going to go bankrupt, and save EDS, which had become part of General Motors but had a tracking stock. We had an EDS stock, but it was 100% controlled by GM, but the public owned part of EDS, which is something we invented. It's a really good idea. And so I went to AT&T. I knew the chief of strategy at AT&T. When AT&T used to be AT&T, like a big company, now it's like all over the place, Verizon and Sprint and all these things. Anyway, it was one gigantic company, and I knew the strategist, and I went to him, And I said, we should take all of your IT, which is $7 billion a year, move it into EDS. We'll run it for you. You will get ownership of a third of EDS. If you take the cost of $7 billion, take the profit we can make, multiply it times the 20 times EPS, the earnings per share, you've taken a cost which is costing you and you've turned it in, you can get free IT and you'll own part of the company that will beat IBM. And he said yes. And they took it to the chairman and he said yes, and they took it to the board and they said yes. I took it to General Motors and they said yes, and I took it to Perot and he said yes. And I declared victory. I said, this is my best idea. And then the chairman of GM asked the vice chairman of GM, the chief of engineering, to negotiate the contract, the acquisition. And I said to the CEO, please don't do that. This vice president of engineering knows nothing about AT&T, has no relationships, knows nothing about our business. Bad idea, don't do that. And the CEO said, of General Motors said, I have to and I will. And he sent him in, and in 24 hours the deal was dead. And at that point I resigned. Now, at the time, I was totally justified. I'd given him a year's warning. I came up with somebody to replace me. I had gone to the EDS leadership team and said, this has not been ever put public. I said, we could either take the value of EDS equal the value of General Motors because of the difference in multiples. I said, we can take over GM if we wanted to, have a hostile takeover from the inside. We could leave GM, or we could just keep doing what we're doing. If we keep doing what we're doing, I'm leaving. If we take over GM, I'm not too happy with that idea, but it looks to me like, these are the kind of alternatives we have, and they won't let us spin it out. So we took a vote, it was 10-10. And I was the 21st vote. I could have voted inside EDS to spin ourselves out or to force a crisis, but I had a split team. So I said, I can't deal with the split team. We're either all in this together, or I want to do it together or not, and I left. Now, I justified that decision because of the technique I used of the voting and giving a year and coming up with a strategy to make General Motors have a company. We would have had $12 billion in revenue and a higher profit rate when IBM had $20 billion of revenue. This is 1986. We would have crushed IBM because we didn't make hardware and we could do anything we wanted to with services. Anyway, I was angry, I was mad, and I was justified. In the last few years, when General Motors went bankrupt, I initially said to myself, you were right. I predicted this, and I told the CEO of GM why they were going to fail, and they followed the plan to failure as if it was a plan to success. They didn't recognize competing people. They didn't use the best technology. They thought the Japanese would copy things. They didn't know that Korea would produce cars, or China. And I said, it happened, and I was right. 2 years ago, it occurred to me I was wrong. And let me tell you why I was wrong. I was arrogant enough to believe that I understood what was going on in GM, and I did. But I was super arrogant because I wanted them to follow my plan, and I didn't give them time to absorb my plan. I gave them conclusions that were too early for them to absorb. It's like teaching a child, in a way. You don't go to a child and say, you're going to be a 6-foot high jumper next year, and they're 6 years old. You say, you got to train, and you got to do this and that and the other, so on and so forth. And I made a mistake. I should have stayed. I should have found a way to convince the officers of GM and I should have found a way to convince the chairman that that was the right plan, and I didn't do it. Now, I don't feel like my life's work has gone down the tubes. All I'm saying is my perspective today is very different than my perspective in 1986. So sometimes when you look at what you've done and what the impact is, and you justify the rightness and correctness of what you've done, as you get older and you have different eyes, frequently it comes in a different place. And I think at that point, I'm going to stop, because I could sit here for an hour and tell you about all the failures, and maybe we ought to take questions.